So over the semester, we've had a great set of lectures. All the early ones are now available at MCAT's website, and the links to those are provided on the lecture series website, which I think I've shared with everybody. If you don't have it, just go to the conservation calendar and you'll see the link to the lecture series website. The last 4 lectures were Zoomed in order to adhere to public health recommendations. And our web wrangler, Sydney Bollinger, thanks Sydney, plans to put those in a form where they'll be available to put online soon. And the links to those will be on the lecture series website also. Once those are available, I will email that out to the class and to the other regular attenders so that you'll know you can go back and watch any that you didn't get to see or rewatch some that you wanted to revisit. Feel free to share that info with other people who might like to look at some of these sustainability lectures, and also share the info about the upcoming Earth Day events. So tonight we'll be addressing what I consider to be one of the toughest issues in seeking sustainability, and that is, how do we go about achieving a sustainable population of humans? I'm going to start out with some information on how a lot of population ecologists view this issue. And then we'll hear from our 2 speakers that represent the Women's Resource Center and Blue Mountain Clinic. And they have both those entities have worked hard to address sustainability through reproductive health justice. If there's enough time at the end, we may share a relevant song on the subject. But I also want to thank the many healthcare workers out there that are working hard to provide reproductive health care during this very difficult time. Planned Parenthood of Missoula and Curry Health Center were both invited to participate, but they just could not manage the time at this time. So I am going to go ahead and do my talk, and then I will introduce our speakers, and they'll give their talks. So as my PowerPoint here says, what we're going to talk about tonight is not just an inconvenient truth like the one that Al Gore talked about, but a pretty heart-wrenching truth. I submit that some of the most key questions in seeking sustainability, one is a global question: what human population can the Earth sustain over the long term while providing a good life for everyone? And that brings up a personal question then: how many children can my own family have and still sustain the Earth? Because when we think about how many people the Earth can accommodate, that says something about what each individual family's fair share of children could be. I always like to make the point that with every right comes a responsibility, and that responsibility is to exercise that right in a way that does not harm the rights of others, either now or in the future. And when it comes to figuring out, again, what is our own personal responsibility with respect to bringing children into the world, again, science guides, but philosophy or ethics takes that scientific information and then decides what we should do. So the guidance from science is that Earth is a self-sustaining living system, highly interconnected system, and it has a limited ability to provide, to maintain a regulated climate and to provide resources at a renewable rate. When we use our resources at an unsustainable rate, that depletes them, and it also ultimately degrades the Earth's ability to regulate the climate and clean the air and water. So that means that there's a limited number of people can be sustained. It's not, we can't just have an unlimited number of people. And that number depends on Earth's limited ability to produce renewable resources and recycle waste. And it also depends on the lifestyles that humans choose, the amount of resources they consume, the amount and kinds of waste that they generate. It also depends on the needs of other life forms. They use pretty much the same resources that we do, So the more resources of land and water that we take, the less there is to support those other species. And the more waste we generate, the harder for other species to survive. So they're very connected to us, and their ability to survive depends on how much we're using. We could argue that there's considerable evidence that human demands already exceed what the Earth can sustain. We can look to the extinction crisis, the climate crisis, the waste crisis, growing number of resource wars, climate refugees, and pandemics. Rather than putting in lots of pictures for this, I just recommend that people look at an online book called Overdevelopment, Overpopulation, and Overshoot. Free book online, and has really powerful images of all these things. So how has science tried to quantify the number of humans that the Earth can sustain? We have a concept in ecology called the carrying capacity or biocapacity of the Earth to support all forms of life. And we can compare that to the total human demands and impacts that humans are exerting on the Earth. And there are some, a couple of related concepts here. The IPAT equation, as it's called, was proposed by Ehrlich and Holden back in the 1970s. And that was kind of updated and made a little more understandable to people by Wackernagel and Rees in the 1990s. They sort of turned it into a concept they called the ecological footprint concept. And so that IPAT equation says that the total impact or demands of humans, that is their footprint on the Earth, is a function of the total human population and also the affluence or quality of life or amount of goods and services used by each person, and also the technology that is used to deliver those goods and services. Is it a very energy efficient technology? Is it based on renewable or non-renewable resources? Does it waste or recycle materials? If we choose simpler lifestyles, we can reduce that, the A part of the equation. And if we choose very efficient technology, we can reduce the T part of the equation. And we have been trying to do that, but if population growth continues, it will quickly wipe out those gains. You may be able to get A and T to go down, but if P population keeps going up, the total impact will keep going up. So when we apply that IPAT equation, or if we go ahead and think of it as ecological footprint analysis, it's hard to assess everything we use at once. So we usually focus on one resource at a time. How much land is being used, or how much water is being used, sometimes how much fossil fuel is used, how much carbon is being released. So the ecological footprint analysis first focused on the amount of land that we used, and then later on they went on to develop a water footprint analysis and a carbon footprint analysis. The land that we use includes the land covered by infrastructure like buildings, roads, and airports, the land used to grow food and produce other renewable resources, and sometimes the land used to produce energy or absorb carbon. And that by no means that's not all the land that we're actually using. So they also use the ecological footprint analysis to estimate what a whole country used. And then they would divide the total land area by its population to give the average footprint per person. So ecological footprint analysis, they developed a lot of simple calculators that you can use. You can answer a few questions about your lifestyle, how much meat you eat, how much waste you generate, how many miles a day you drive in a car, whatever. And then it will adjust your personal footprint up or down slightly from the average for your country. And this allows people to see how their lifestyle choices affect their footprint. But it also allows them to see that a lot of their footprint is not really up to them. They can't change it that much through their lifestyle choices because it's dictated by how their society has designed its food and transportation and manufacturing systems. you can answer the questions and claim that you never drive, that you never eat any meat, and you don't generate any waste at all. You can answer all the lifestyle questions in a pretty extreme fashion, and it will still say that as an American, you're using quite a lot of land because they give you your share of the roads and the hospitals and the built infrastructure and all that sort of thing. If you would like to calculate your footprint at some point, the Global Footprint Network does have a calculator that you can use. There used to be a lot of these calculators online, but when I went looking the other day, I found that many of them now say we couldn't get funding to update our calculator anymore, so we're sort of shutting it down. So the ecological footprint analysis also estimated the biocapacity of the Earth and divided that by the population to obtain what they called your fair share. And you could compare your own footprint to your fair share and determine whether you're using more than your fair share. Usually the answer in the United States is, yes, I'm using more than my fair share. You should also notice that as the population grows, we're going to be dividing. The Earth's biocapacity stays the same. So as the population grows, your fair share gets smaller and smaller. And I'll remind you guys that when Rob Davies came and talked in Missoula at the big climate event, I pointed out that one of the things he did was he took the remaining fossil carbon that we can burn without pushing the Earth over the edge and divided it by the human population to produce your fair share of that. And he pointed out that it was pretty small, and the average US citizen would burn through it in just a few years. So some of the other things that were concluded with ecological footprint analysis is that the total human footprint now exceeds the Earth's biocapacity. And they borrowed some ideas from economics. They say that the Earth has a lot of savings that have accrued over time, and the Earth principle is always producing additional renewable resources that we can think of as the Earth's interest. It's the additional resources produced each year. And if we just use the Earth interest, then we would never run out of the principle. But we're not just living on Earth's interest. We now use up some of that Earth principle each year. They estimate what they call the Earth Overshoot Day, which is the day each year that we have now used up what the Earth produces in a year, and now we're starting to use up Earth principle. Back in the 1970s, that didn't happen until December, but now it happens in August. And some of the evidence, again, for this is deforestation, desertification, declining fisheries, eroding soils, and species extinctions. All these show that we are using things at a faster rate than the Earth can resupply them. So some people say, well, isn't this just due to some people over-consuming? If we change our light bulbs to more efficient light bulbs, if we all buy electric cars, if we eat less meat, won't we be okay, even allowing the population to continue to grow? And it is true that some human populations do use a lot more than others do. The ecological footprint analysis says that if all 7.7 billion people on the Earth lived like the average US citizen, it would take from 5 to 10 Earths to support them sustainably without cutting into the Earth principle. And the reason there's such a range there, 5 to 10 Earths, depends on how much of the Earth's resources we feel need to be set aside to support other life forms. Some people say very little, and others say we ought to give them half. Isn't that generous of us? We'll only take half, and all the rest of the species on Earth have to live on the other half. So which lifestyles would we all have to adopt for one Earth to be able to sustain 7.7 billion people? Well, according to ecological footprint analysis, we'd all have to adopt the lifestyles of the very poorest people on the planet, the people that we had hoped to lift out of poverty. So while we do need to reduce the consumption of the richest 20% on the planet and use more efficient technologies, it's unlikely this alone would reduce total consumption enough, especially if the population continues to grow and if we do what we hope to do, which is to raise that poorest 80% out of poverty. I'm sure you've all seen little statistics like this. The US is 5% of the world's population, using 24% of its energy, and the world's wealthiest 26% uses 80% of the natural resources. So yes, there's great inequity, and there needs to be more equity, but dividing it all up equally would just make everybody poor unless we address the population problem. So coming back to that tough old question, how many people can the Earth support? You'll find, even in the scientific literature, a very wide range of estimates depending on what assumptions you make. The highest estimates you'll find are based on assuming that the most limiting factor is the land to grow food. So if that's the limiting factor, then we're assuming that we have unlimited water and energy to grow that food, that we can continue using fossil fuels and high-tech agriculture, that we devote all of the productive land to growing food for humans and leave nothing for any other species. And then, yes, you can get estimates of 10 billion or more people can be supported, but that's unrealistic and it's also unsustainable. So let's get real. We have to keep some of the land natural and wild to support other forms of life and ecosystem services like the water cycle, climate stability, soil regeneration, pollination services, and many more things. How much land do we need to keep wild and natural? You'll see estimates anywhere from 10 to 50%. The 10% are, they came up with that number just to pass the last laugh test, and also because we're already protecting about 15%. But if you ask the conservation biologists who are studying extinction, their recommendation is 50% for all the other life forms that are out there, and not just 50% of the deserts and mountaintops where a lot of our protected land is now. They need to have 50% of the most productive ecosystems as well. In addition to setting aside land for other life forms and ecosystem services, we also know that we need to stop using fossil fuels and use renewable energy. That means we're going to have a lot less energy to work with than we have been using. Some of the geologists estimate that we burn through over 400 years worth of Earth production every year in the form of fossil fuels. And even solar and wind devices require some energy to make them and don't last forever. So we'll always be having to put some energy back into upgrading and making new solar and wind devices. And lastly, people need more than food. They need clean air and water and shelter and mobility and healthcare and education. And these all require resources also. So let's assume that we give everyone a modest Scandinavian lifestyle. That's one of the less consumptive, more energy efficient lifestyles that has a good quality of life with education and healthcare for all. Now, how many people can we support with those assumptions? You see estimates generally around 1 billion, sometimes as much as 2 billion, once again, depending on how much land you set aside for other species. We're already at 8 times 1 billion. 1 billion was what the world was at back in 1800. And that probably was a pretty sustainable population. But this is what the world's population has done since then. It has just exploded as we harnessed all that ancient fossil sunlight in the form of fossil fuels and started burning it at 400 years a year. And we also learned how to control many bacterial diseases, which then allowed more crowding. That's how we saw this explosive human population growth. So if 1 billion is the sustainable population, or somewhere around 1 to 2 billion, how many kids is your fair share? Well, to stabilize the population and stop growth, that would be 2 kids per family. That's the replacement rate, 2 kids for 2 parents. And to start moving toward a sustainable population, we'd have to encourage the new norm to be 1 kid per family. So then in a generation, 8 billion would become 4 billion. In another generation, 4 billion would become 2 billion. And in 3 generations, 2 billion would become 1 billion. So that takes a while, and it also takes a major change in what we consider the norms in society. given that reducing population would take a while, we would have to reduce affluence considerably and increase technological efficiency. Those are things we're working on right now. But again, they can only do so much. And certainly, many people might feel that it's very draconian or harsh to tell people to have only one child. But when you consider the alternative, what has limited the human population in the past, the four horsemen of the apocalypse, war and conquest, including what we now see as resource wars, famine, pestilence, like our current pandemics, and now we can add another horseman, climate chaos. And these are a lot harsher ways to limit the human population or bring it down to what the earth can support. So that's a lot of painful truths, but there is one happy one. Unlike some of our problems, we have a simple, affordable technology that can address the population problem. That is family planning services. And I've seen some estimates that we could provide family planning services for free to everybody on the planet for 3% of what we spend on military and weapons. And we're going to hear tonight about the struggle to keep family planning services affordable and accessible. That was a struggle even before the current pandemic. It is certainly a struggle now during the pandemic, and it will likely be a struggle afterwards. But I do hope people will think some about how do we go about getting folks to limit themselves to one child per couple? That is, how do we get them to exercise their right to parent responsibly? We got so far into this pandemic by not listening to the scientists. We're in a terrible climate crisis by not listening to the scientists. And once again, the people who studied the Earth's ability to support human population in a good lifestyle say that we are already over what the Earth can support sustainably. We are using up Earth's principle. We're not living on the interest. So our speakers tonight are, we have Leah Volpa, with the Women's Resource Center. She's a sophomore studying environmental studies and Spanish at and she interns there at the Women's Resource Center. That is a student-run organization, and over the course of this internship, she has been working on the intersection of family planning and sustainability on a global scale. And I want to point out that the Women's Resource Center started back in 1968 on the U of M campus as the Women's Action Center. And then later it split into the Women's Resource Center and Women's Place. They put on conferences, and early on they provided free nursery and pregnancy referral service. And Leah will, I'm sure, will talk some about what their current programs are. And our other speaker is Elizabeth Hubble. She directs UM's Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program. And her research has focused on integrating gender-based violence prevention in the humanities classroom and using online feminist activism as a lens to understand writing by women back even in medieval times. She serves as the president of the Blue Mountain Clinic Board of Directors, and the Blue Mountain Clinic is a local clinic that provides patient-centered family practice and primary care services to the local community. So I will turn it over to them now. And I thank them very much for being here. Who would like to go first?
I can start.
Yeah, great.
Hi, Leah.
Hi. So let me try and share my screen so I can get my PowerPoint up. Okay. Can everyone see my screen?
I can.
Okay. Yeah, so yeah, as Vicki said, I'm currently interning at the Women's Resource Center. And so over the course of this semester, I have studied ecofeminism and then more specifically family planning and sustainability. So I'm just going to kind of give an overview about what family planning is, and this presentation is more focused on a global scale, and then I'll talk a little bit about what the Women's Resource Center does. So as Vicki just talked about, the current population is 7.7 billion, which is unsustainable, and scientists have long debated what the Earth's carrying capacity is, but I think we can all agree that it's not 7.7 billion people. And so as population increases, quality of life decreases, and resources become more stretched. And so one solution to that is family planning, as we've talked about. So according to the World Health Organization, family planning allows people to attain their desired number of children and determine the spacing of pregnancies. It is achieved through contraceptive methods and the treatment of infertility. And it is also important to note that family planning is not forced sterilization, restrictions on the number of children a family can have, like China's one-child policy, or dictating when a family can have children. And so family planning is very important in sustainability because studies have shown that when family planning is provided for couples, they usually will choose to have fewer children. And this leads to an increase in household resources per capita and a decrease in the couple's carbon footprint. And a study of this was done in California, in which a voluntary family planning program was implemented for couples. And it was found that it was the single most cost-effective way to abate carbon dioxide emissions. And I think a lot of people think oftentimes that family planning is just for third world countries, but it's important to realize that it is just as effective, if not more, in first world countries than the rest of the world. And that is because per capita emissions in wealthier countries are much greater than those in low income countries. For example, in the US, per capita emissions are more than double the global average, and therefore family planning has a great effect on wealthy countries. And averting an unintended pregnancy in high-emitting countries will do more to help the climate than will averting a similar pregnancy in low-emitting countries due to the per capita emissions. And so one organization that I looked at is Project Drawdown, which is an organization that has created a comprehensive list of climate solutions. And these solutions are ranked, and there's a whole bunch of them. I encourage you to check out their website if you haven't already. It's very hopeful to see that there's so many solutions. And on the list, educating girls is ranked number 6 as the 6th most impactful solution to climate change. And family planning is ranked number 7. And according to those who are part of Project Drawdown, including scholars, scientists, and entrepreneurs, women with more education have fewer and healthier children and actively manage their reproductive health. And so some of the key strategies that are used for this family planning and educating girls are to make school affordable, help girls overcome health barriers, reduce time and distance to get to school, and make schools more girl-friendly. And so these solutions have shown to naturally help decrease the population, because when girls have an education, they're more likely to have fewer children. And so at the University of Montana, the Women's Resource Center is a student-run, consensus-based organization dedicated to raising awareness of women's and gender issues. And as Vicki said, it was started in 1968. And so currently, the Women's Resource Center provides a current list of organizations and professionals that serve to assist individuals in Western Montana with family planning or other needs. And also provides a safe place for support or to discuss pertinent issues with others. And so one of the main things that the Women's Resource Center does is host interns like myself, and they are currently seeking interns for fall of 2020 if anyone's interested. They have also put on different conferences and fundraisers, and I believe in the fall, there's going to be a celebration for the 50th anniversary of the Women's Resource Center. So it's a really great organization that just focuses on helping college students and just people in Western Montana with family planning and other relevant needs. And so that's kind of my general overview. I thought I would end with a quote, and then if there's time for questions, I would be open for that. But I thought this quote kind of summed up family planning really well, and this is from Project Drawdown, their website. And it says, when family planning focuses on healthcare provision and meeting women's expressed needs, empowerment, equality, and well-being are the result. The benefits to the planet are side effects. And so that's what I have for now.
Thanks, Leah. I think what we'll do is go ahead and have Beth give her talk, and then we'll collect questions at the end. We usually do that by having people just submit them through the chat.
Sure, yeah, that sounds perfect.
So I think I shared a screen. I'm not used to being a participant and not the person running the Zoom classes. So I'm gonna try to, I pulled up the Blue Mountain Clinic website here. As Vicki said, I direct the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program on campus, and I'm also the faculty advisor for the Women's Resource Center. One of the things that I was thinking while Leah was talking was the fact that it was the same women who started the Women's Resource Center as founded Blue Mountain Clinic. Blue Mountain Clinic was founded in the 70s by names that are still talked of today in Missoula, in the feminist circles that I'm in, people like Judy Smith and Diane Sands, who were integral in founding the Women's Resource Center on campus as well. The Women's Resource Center also was the first place that women's studies classes were taught at UM by faculty who did it for free in the Women's Resource Center, which at the time was in the UC, where the market is now, I understand it. So just thinking of those connections of those women working in the late 60s through the 70s in Missoula, making a really big difference. I've been the president of the board of directors of Blue Mountain Clinic for the past 3 years. I've been on the board for a longer span of time than that. And I think it's important for me to start and say my connection with Blue Mountain Clinic goes back to 1993, in fact. In 1993, a man, it's on here on the website, on March 29th of 1993, a man named Richard Andrews made a trip across the northwest of the United States, firebombing abortion clinics. And Blue Mountain Clinic was one of those. And the clinic that was then located, I believe on Kensington, was completely destroyed. It was firebombed at 4 o'clock in the morning. And it was the Missoula community that came back together to rebuild and put us in our current location, which is on Broadway and down by Missoula Youth Homes and the Cider Place. And usually people know where it is because a few times a year you'll see the protesters standing on Broadway out there. And so that new location that we removed, where Blue Mountain Clinic was rebuilt. What's my connection to that? 1993. I was an undergrad at the University of Montana, and they were tabling in the UC, and I was walking through the UC, and I saw them tabling, doing fundraising after the firebombing, and it was my first ever donation to a nonprofit organization. I wrote a check to Blue Mountain Clinic, and so that I always think about that when I in terms of my connections with Blue Mountain Clinic. Today, the clinic is a full family medicine clinic, but it started as an abortion clinic and expanded over time, looking at how important it was to integrate all healthcare into a reproductive health model. And so providing for people's entire lives, both health care, but also mental health care, and abortion services, and birth control, family planning, all of those things. And, you know, Blue Mountain Clinic sees between 9,000 and 10,000 patients a year now. And many of those patients, most of those patients are not going to the clinic for the abortion services. They want to go there because of the care that they receive. Blue Mountain Clinic is also one of the only independent nonprofit abortion clinics in the United States. And we're sometimes confused with Planned Parenthood. While we work very closely with Planned Parenthood, we are a separate, completely separate organization. And one of the reasons that that separation was always really strong was that Blue Mountain Clinic has never accepted what's known as Title X funding. Title X funding comes from the federal government for people who need financial assistance to access birth control and things like that. Planned Parenthood, that's the reason until last year, and still today, you go to Planned Parenthood and you'd be able to have a sliding fee scale for birth control and annual exams and things like that. Blue Mountain Clinic never had a sliding scale and never accepted that federal funding because it keeps us separate from some of what happened with Planned Parenthood last summer, which was increased regulation about what clinics accepting Title X funding, and a requirement that they could not refer patients to abortion clinics. And so Planned Parenthood made the decision last year to stop taking that funding. So that's a little bit of history of Blue Mountain Clinic right now. When you're involved with a healthcare clinic, it is a fairly exciting time as the president of the board of directors, when my background is in literature and women's gender and sexuality studies. I've learned a lot more than I ever knew in the past about operating of a healthcare clinic, as we've had to adapt to what's going on now. And one of the amazing things is that we'd already been moving to a telemedicine model. And so a lot of patients are being seen that way. But as is the case across the country, abortion is being seen as an essential service, and our doctor at the clinic is still providing in-person abortion care. And so that this shift right now to seeing patients remotely and things like that, but continuing to provide that care, because I think if people follow the news, know that in 7 states across the nation that the coronavirus has been used as a reason to stop abortion care, because under an argument that it should not be considered essential care, and it's taking away equipment that could be used for other people. It's been blocked, and that has been blocked by courts in several states, especially with the argument of now the safety and prevalence of medical abortions with the drug that I'm going to try to pronounce right. I practiced it today because I only ever read it. Mifepristone. And that's actually one of the things that is going to connect to that. One of the questions that Vicki had was, how do we keep, one of the things that's foremost in my mind, how do you keep abortion safe and legal, but how do you keep it affordable and accessible? And I have a close friend who is from Missoula, but she actually works in West Africa for an organization called DKT International. And they work around the world, but in Africa, providing family planning services and training for women in Africa. And they're able to provide those because of the availability of generic brands of that drug that the FDA won't approve. And so one of the things that is hard in the U.S. is just the cost of accessing these services. The other issue with accessibility is, somewhere around 25% or more of Blue Mountain Clinic's patients come from outside of Missoula. outside of Missoula County, and as we get out further, that Montana is one of the places where we actually have programs set up to provide gas vouchers for people that have to drive to Missoula for these services. So that's a lot of background on. I'm going to try not to talk too much. This is all, I both teach it and then all the nonprofit work with Blue Mountain Clinic. And I would encourage people, if you've never even seen the clinic, to go by it, to drive by, because you'll know you're there when you see the 7-foot-high fences with the barbed wire on top, and you see a building that looks like a bunker because of the insurance requirements for everything to be bulletproof, to be bomb-proof, all of those things, and the amazing staff that go to work every day. You know, they actually, last time I went through protesters, and that work that has to be done, and those on all levels. I'm also really interested on another level here when we talk about issues of sustainability and family planning, to think about what the issues are in the US right now around that overall and historically. And so for me, I'm really thinking about what are the ways that we get some kind of agreement on having fewer children, things like that. Because I teach about, you know, like Leah talked about at the beginning of her PowerPoint, I teach about the history of forced sterilization in the US. I teach about eugenics at the turn of the 20th century. I teach about those things. And so that there's a real tension right now about controlling women's bodies, and you know, what is that intersection with groups of people, Native American groups, women of color, who have a fairly torturous history with the US government around issues of reproduction, and you know, just if you've never done, I mean, and this is not after the PowerPoint though, if you've never done research into forced sterilization on Native American reservations in Montana or around the nation, you know, that's an issue too. So that's one of the things that I brought up with Vicki, was kind of that tension of when we talk about reproductive technologies, when we talk about family planning. I've been looking at this organization, DKT, who they have that kind of train the trainer model of getting buy-in from groups of women in the countries that they're working in, to have the message be that ground up and message instead of instead of, you know, someone coming in and saying who gets to have babies, who doesn't get to have babies, those kind of ideas, because there's so many messages around that that are very problematic. So I think one of the last issues that I want to cover is it has become apparent to me as I teach what I teach, and as I work with Blue Mountain Clinic, and as someone who obviously is very closely connected to the abortion rights movement, that we've seen over the last few years with court cases like the Burwell versus Hobby Lobby, that very much that the issue is not ending abortions. That refusal to even pay for women's birth control points to a larger issue about controlling women's bodies, and constructing women in certain traditional roles, and that you know, putting us in boxes. I'm thinking about constructions of motherhood, and you know, that idea and how that's going to hit up against the sustainability. I often talk in my classes and tell a story that I'll have people challenge me and say things like, well, what about, you know, women who just have more babies for whatever reason, and calling people welfare moms and things like that. And yet for me, and I have a son, I've had people ask me multiple times why I only had one. And on one very memorable occasion, I had a person actually say to me that I was the kind of person who should have more kids. And my head exploded. I went, what kind of, do you mean white and middle class? And there was so much to unpack there. And I think, you know, if it seems like I'm getting a little bit away from that main topic, I don't think that I am, because it is tied up a lot in these gender ideas and looking at these groups that are denying climate change. All these things are connected to all these groups that are fighting to not pay for birth control, that are fighting to make abortion illegal. And so just how does that connect in to these questions of sustainability, and how does it kind of open up debate around these things? And I'm going to stop there, because if I can talk for a really long time about these issues. So that's my last thing.
Well, thank both of you. I'll invite folks if they'd like to send in some questions via chat. I was going to say that when I was growing up, I would often hear people ask the question, you know, how many children should you have? And the answer was usually something like, well, you have as many as you want, but no more than you can afford to give a good life. And I always felt like, well, doesn't that mean then that rich people have the right to have more kids than poor people do? I would like to have some more egalitarian approach to that. And that's why I, you know, make the argument that we've grown our population to the point now where we need to turn around and go the other way. And the only way to do that is with really small families, one-child families, and even families that choose to have no children. And of course, the only way you can do that is you've got to have a really good social security system to ensure that childless people will still be taken care of. And I also thought it would be a good idea to come up with a system where little kids adopted more grandparents. You know, so like all the kids in my neighborhood have adopted me as another grandparent. And I also like to point out that my great-grandmother had 12 children. My grandmother had 9 children. My mother had 5 children. Of her 5 children, 3 had no children at all. 2 of us had 1 each, and our only children had only children. So my family certainly in earlier generations contributed to that explosive growth, but turned around and started going the other way and trying to work towards a more sustainable size population. And I just wondered if people thought, if that was a part of what people are taught in school, that we now have more people than we can support in a good life, it's time to go with, turn around and go with really small families. Do you think that would be a winning argument for people?
So I'm not going to be the same generation as the students, but I'm still surprised at all the messages we get not in school, or that students tell me they get from society more in general. You know, I always ask, you know, my classes, which I teach almost only women's gender sexuality studies classes, but I'll say, you know, who wants to have kids? And, you know, not, I mean, 50-50, or even, you know, skewing towards more people not wanting to have kids. And then I say to them, and when you tell someone you don't want to have kids, what is the first thing you hear? And all of them will say in unison, you'll change your mind. And so that kind of message that's just kind of part of what life entails is, I think, is still really reinforced. I joke as well that I think when I got married, I joke that someone stopped us on our way back down the aisle to ask when we were going to have kids, because that's about when it started. And then when I chose to only have one, the number of people that have told me that he's going to turn out weird because he's an only child, you know, that, and warning me about those things has been really surprising as well. And I always say back to that, I don't think he's going to be weird because he's an only child. He's going to be weird because I'm his mother. I don't think that's the, I don't think that's an, but I think we get so many messages about, you know, these are the steps you take in life. And so pushing back against that. But I agree with your statement about the fewer kids, that, you know, in the generations in around my life, as well. And, you know, how do we start giving, different kind of media messages about that? What does family look like today? And getting away from that idea of a nuclear family with, you know, 2 parents, 2-3 kids, and showing, I like that idea of a more inclusive, extended, not necessarily biologically related family, in terms of support systems. Even, I mean, for families themselves today, having those wider spread communities of support would be greatly helpful, because one of the things I didn't talk about was, you know, one of the things that greatly impacts parents today, whether it's a couple or a single parent, is how much it costs. And the fact that the United States has no parental leave policy. And so that those decisions that you have to make about how much time can you take off if you have a kid, how much your healthcare costs having a kid, all of those things that you know, there was a trend, I tried to look it up today a little bit, but a few articles from 5-6 years ago about more working class couples choosing to have none or one kid just because of the cost. And I have friends that stopped, you know, at more of the middle class, upper middle class level. I had female friends who actually stopped working because it was going to cost more to send their kids to full-time daycare than they were making at their jobs. So
Leah has some thoughts on that too.
Yeah, I agree with all of that, and I think it's difficult because I mean, I haven't really ever discussed family planning in any of my environmental studies classes. I think it's a really taboo subject at this point, but and I think that's because a lot of people automatically think of forced sterilization or a one-child policy type thing, but I definitely think it needs to be part of the curriculum because it is a huge aspect of sustainability and the climate crisis. And then I think it also needs to be portrayed differently in the media, like Beth was saying, just because a lot of, yeah, it's taught that having children is just part of life and that that's what you do. But I think changing that narrative is important too for the sustainability aspect of it, for sure.
Well, we don't have any questions from our audience yet. Anybody want to send in a question? Perhaps I can encourage them to do so by saying that if we don't have any questions, then I have enough time to sing.
So
Still no questions. Oh, well.
they want you to sing.
They want me to sing. Okay.
One question I get a lot is safety issues about being associated with an abortion clinic. And I've never had anything. My name and everything is up on their website. I've actually gotten, oh, that's a good question. I've actually had gotten more attacks from teaching women's gender and sexuality studies in Missoulian comments and things like that than anything to do with Blue Mountain Clinic. So that's really changed. So question about adoption fitting into the equation.
Well, there are always going to be kids that need to be adopted because something has happened to their parents, or, you know, wars and so on.
Yeah, I think for me, just speaking from personal experience, I've always thought that um, if I do choose to have children, I would maybe probably go the adoption route just because of the sustainability argument and just being the type of person that is very passionate about sustainability and my individual actions. And yeah, it is true that there will always be children that need to be adopted. But in my research, I didn't really see much um, specific evidence or like research on family planning in relation to adoption.
So I have a comment that there are millions around the world who need good parenting. It is certainly, given that even under that, my idealized scenario of one-child families, it would still take 3 generations to get down to what this ecological analysis suggests is a sustainable population with a good life for all. Takes 3 generations to get there, and in the meantime, there certainly can be many families that are a little larger than that through adoption.
Um, I'm reading questions now. And so the question about that the enforcement of that one child policy, that's where I hit. I mean, a few different things, but talking about eugenics, forced sterilization, when you get to that, and when you're thinking about that, those policies, that's where I think it runs into that issue of that enforcement from above instead of that changing from below, because as was witnessed with eugenics, which ultimately gives us Nazi Germany. Who gets to decide who gets to decide who gets to have kids, who gets to decide what qualities, things like that. I think it ends up in a really I think we end up back with controlling people's bodies in a way that I have a hard time kind of teasing some of those things out, and that's why I kind of like that. I like the grassroots solution.
And by grassroots solution, you mean education and empowerment of girls and women.
Yes.
And affordable, accessible, free, if necessary, family planning for all. And
yes.
I always like to make the argument that free family planning for all and education and empowerment of girls is probably one of the best ways to reduce the need for abortions.
That's my argument. That's where in this last decade or so, and especially in the last few years, of the realization that the people that are fighting against abortion also don't like birth control. And that's where my mind went, there's something something else is going on here, because that's what we want: family planning, we want education, we want access to birth control, and guess what's going to happen? There will be way fewer abortions. Mm-hmm. And so that's the one that just gets me is not wanting women to have easy access, or anyone to have easy access, but especially having insurance companies pay for birth control, things like that. That just boggles my, well, it doesn't boggle my mind. It comes down to it's about controlling as the women's studies professor, it comes down to me, it's about controlling women's bodies more than it's about anything else. So
the issue has been brought up that often is that if we go to one-child families, we're going to change the age distribution. We're going to wind up with an older population, and harder for the baby bust coming behind the baby boom to pay to care for that older generation. And nobody said this was going to be easy, but you know, the four horsemen riding down on us makes us realize we need to do something. And at some point you have to turn around and go the other way. And it is certainly the case that my mother had 5 kids to take care of her in her old age. I have 1 kid. My 2 sisters have no children. You know, who is going to take care of us in our old age? Well, we're all determined, for one thing, to you know, working really hard to stay healthy and independent and take care of ourselves as much as we possibly can. And people are working longer. You know, we're living longer, and so we're also working longer, continuing to work longer, because, you know, if you're healthy enough to do so, you should continue to work and contribute and continue to try to care. Who's taking care of my oldest sister now? My youngest sister is taking care of her because she doesn't have any children. And it's not going to be easy. It is one of the challenges of trying to turn that population curve around. Oh, Ryan points out that this will also is often argued to be bad for the economy, because people are used to, or the argument has often been made that the economy has to keep growing. The only way to pull people out of poverty is for the economy to keep growing. And I will encourage people to take a look at the website of the Center for the Advancement of a Sustainable Economy. And they make some powerful arguments for, obviously, continued growth is not sustainable. So how do we make that transition to a sustainable economy, not based on constant growth? And several of the requirements of that is that the population keeps growing, but also that consumption be reduced, not amongst the poorest. They're going to have some increase in consumption, but amongst the richest. So a number of things, you know, it's going to require a number of things. It's not easy any more than addressing climate change is easy. It's just that none of these things are going to be ultimately achievable if the population keeps growing. It keeps making everything harder and harder. There will be sacrifices. Raymond asked if China still had a one-child policy.
I don't believe so. I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure that that's no. I think they had a lot of unforeseen issues with that, specifically relating to favoring male children, which then increased children in orphanages. I remember reading an article about that a little while ago.
And that I Googled it, and people had already, no surprise that the students were faster than me at Googling. But yeah, and Googling it, some of it having, the labor shortages, urban versus rural populations as well. And if people have looked at India, where India now is out of whack because of selective abortions in favor of boy babies, that they now have significantly more, as opposed to like our kind of 49-51, 49 men, 51 women, if we're going to stick with that binary. And I don't really have time to dissect it tonight. And that's not what I'm here for. But that India was up higher into the 50s with men, and men having to get wives from other places. And so that it's one of those impacts of what does this one child policy do, especially when you're favoring one gender over the other. And
More questions? I see one from Isabella. The need to reduce population, have fewer children, and those that believe that or don't understand it will reproduce at a higher rate. And therefore, eventually the higher rate, those who reproduce at a higher rate will replace those who reproduce at a lower rate. And so they will come to have the majority opinion. And that probably is part of why that J-shaped curve looks like it did, that explosive growth that is generally recognized by ecologists as unsustainable. So, yeah, it's quite, a conundrum is a great way to put it, Isabella. So Raymond says, who really benefits from a rising stock market but the 1%ers? A growing economy mainly benefits the top, doesn't benefit the poor that much. So.
And and a lot of that is, again, that on kind of an education level, but also a lot of the myths that we really hold on to in the US, like anyone can pull themselves up by their bootstraps and things like that, that having to fight back against some of those stories that we tell ourselves about the American dream.
Well, are we about ready to wrap it up for tonight? Are you guys going to tolerate one quick song? This is a song that I performed at a Blue Mountain Clinic fundraiser a few years ago. Let's see here. Wanna get frisky, don't wanna pay the price. Love can be risky, better follow this advice. You better wrap that rascal. Wrap that rascal. Gotta wrap that rascal if you wanna get along with me. Two young lovers lying in bed, one snuggled up to the other and said, why don't we wrap that rascal? Wrap that rascal. Gotta wrap that rascal if you want to get along with me. If you have affection, share with someone else. But if you have infections, keep them to yourself. You better wrap that rascal. Wrap that rascal. Gotta wrap that rascal if you want to get along with me. Concerning making babies, they're a long time small. If you don't want to bring them up, don't bring it up at all unless you wrap that rascal. Wrap that rascal. Gotta wrap that rascal if you want to get along with me. Well, Earth's getting crowded, we're headed for a fall. We gotta shrink our footprint and keep our family small. We gotta wrap those rascals. Wrap those rascals. Gotta wrap those rascals if you wanna get along with me. Well, thankfully now we have even better birth control methods than wrapping those rascals with condoms. But it's still probably one of the best ways to avoid spreading certain infections, right? Is that part of what's taught at Blue Mountain Clinic?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that drove our Off the Rack fundraiser with the condom fashion for years.
Right.
Yes, yeah, and I've actually
we missed that a lot.
And I was reading today about the impact on the Trump's reinstated in 2017 the global gag rule, which doesn't allow any U.S. funding to go to any organization around the world if they provide abortion or even really talk about it. And that actually a huge percentage of that $9 million that would have been going to some organizations, about $9 billion, yeah, that about 2/3 of it was going to organizations who also worked significantly in HIV and AIDS prevention around the world. And so there's been a really big impact on funding for those organizations because those were often going hand in hand.
I see.
Yeah.
Well, I will say about HIV AIDS that it's another example, like the coronavirus, of a disease that jumped from wildlife to people. There have been just one of those after another, And I sent, one of the things I sent out to the students was about an interview with David Quammen, who wrote a book about wildlife diseases jumping from wildlife to people, and how that is expected to become more and more common because of both we're crowding the wildlife out of their habitat, so they are coming more and more in contact with people. We're also eating more meat, and those wet markets, as they're called, is one of the places where that jump happens. And then once the disease jumps to people, the fact that people are so overcrowded in so many places, they can't socially distance, then the disease spreads through people very rapidly. So Quammen's explanation of all these diseases was that they basically were all tied to the exploding human population, crowding out wildlife and crowding people together, and that's why we get these epidemics passing through. So, okay, well, looks like we don't have any, oh, wait, what's that book? It's called, the big book about, it's in the email that I sent you guys. I can't quite, Spillover. I think it's called Spillover, is Quammen's book about the wildlife diseases spilling over into the human population. And the other book that I recommended was Overdevelopment, Overpopulation, and Overshoot, which is basically a huge picture book that tells a very interesting story about the human species and its journey, and encourages us to get back in harmony with the earth and recognize its limits and live within those limits. So another one. So who okayed reopening the wet markets? In China, you mean? I don't, you mean like in the Wuhan province or where it happened? I know they've ended the lockdown of most of the forms of most of the businesses. I hadn't heard that they reopened the wet markets. If they did, that
Vicki,
seems like really poor.
They are reopened. Also saw something that the WHO actually okayed it. China.
WHO did?
Yes. China back in the 70s, I think, was finding it very hard under the communist regime back then to feed their people. So people left to their own devices went to anything in sight: monkeys, lizards, tarantulas, you name it. And the Chinese Communist Party kind of said, this looks like it's working. Let's let them eat whatever they want and let's sanction it. Let's make it legal. And therefore they did. And now you get what you get, because all this garbage, all these SARS and Corona, that's where it comes from, these ignorance of the wet markets where you have all these wild animals living on top of each other, 4 or 5 cages high, and they're all pooping on each other, and they slaughter them right in the market there for consumption, for people to often, it's so some rich Chinaman can treat his erectile dysfunction or whatever, along with, worldwide things like rhinoceros horn and shark fin soup and all of that garbage that always goes to the rich, the super rich in China, who think it's going to solve one of their medical maladies. It's an abomination. It really is. And they have been reopened, and they'll continue to operate, and we'll continue to get these pandemics.
Yeah. And I guess about all we can do is keep pointing that out and making the argument that that is a foolish policy, and that they're asking for trouble, and as soon as another one pops up, we have to lock down allowing anything to come in from China, which, since we're rather dependent on China at present for at least a lot of cheap junk, maybe once again, people deciding to live simpler lives and not need a lot of cheap material goods. Maybe we don't need to import so much from China, and hopefully they'll decide they don't need us, and they'll focus on their own people. And I guess have always felt that so much interglobal trade has a lot of downsides to it. It makes people forget to try to be as sustainable and self-sufficient locally as they can be.
Well, unfortunately, no one's going to control China, and even our leadership can't decide if they're good guys or bad guys, or if they love them or they hate them. There's a lot of evidence to show that they basically own the World Health Organization and told them, hey, hush, hush, don't say anything yet because we think we have this under control. And by the time it was actually declared a pandemic and a worldwide emergency, it was too late. The cat was out of the bag, cow was out of the barn. And even after we supposedly shut off incoming people from China, I think up to 40,000 Chinese still got into this country. So it's China basically owns us, and that's why we don't say anything to them. We don't come down hard on them because, you know, all of the trade we have, we're relying on them, the trade deficits. It's not a good situation, and no one's going to rein them in.
So I just put in the comments, it's not related to this exactly, but it's not a new documentary. It's called Mardi Gras Made in China, and it is a documentary filmmaker who went to the factories in China that teenage girls are working at making the Mardi Gras beads. Oh. And he interviewed them and looked at the factory, and then he went to New Orleans and interviewed the people and looked at the beads. And so from my perspective, it looks both at kind of sweatshop workers and the gender perspective, because a number of the girls in the factory that he was at in China were working there to send money home so their parents could pay for their brothers to go to school. And that it's just, you know, if you're looking for something to watch and a critique of Mardi Gras in New Orleans all at the same time, it's a really interesting documentary.
And our consumerism supports exactly that. We got to have everything in the world, and it's got to be cheap, and it's got to be
yep. And that's kind of an undercurrent. Is he asks people in New Orleans, where do you think those beads came from? And he interviews them and asks them. And then he shows the girls in China video of what their beads are being used for in New Orleans.
So of course, another choice people can make is they can say, I'm going to purchase American or fair trade. I'm going to try to avoid sweatshop products and also just only get what I need instead of lots and lots of stuff. So, well, I really appreciate all the comments and the insights you guys shared. And again, this good old Sydney is going to archive these so that people can continue to share them as well as the earlier presentations, and they will all be accessible through that through the lecture series website. But this is the last of the lecture series. Tough, probably, like I say, one of the toughest topics that we dealt with. And next week, I highly recommend that folks participate in the local Earth Day, the virtual rally that will be on Earth Day itself from noon to 2. And you can find the Zoom website, the Zoom link on that Earth Day Missoula website. And there will be other things going on during the week. I did send folks some ideas for more action projects. We are going to really struggle to pull off our farmers markets this year. You know, how are we going to do the farmers market when you think about what that usually looks like, that jam-packed area? They're going to be figuring out how to spread people out And they're also going to encourage people to order what they want from the farmer's market and have it, you know, packed up and delivered to them instead. So we may be doing something like the elderly farmers will be encouraged to do all their stuff as delivery, people ordering it in advance and delivering it. And then maybe the younger farmers that are at less risk will be at the farmer's market. So we're still trying to figure out how to do it, but they're going to need a lot of volunteers to help manage the distancing and manage the packing up and delivery of food. It's going to be an interesting thing. And at least we don't have a lot of live wildlife at the markets, thankfully. That's something we have not adopted from the Chinese. So I see, I'm new to the area. Where is the farmer's market located and when does it begin running?
I don't know the when, but I put the where.
Right. So we have several in Missoula. And the small communities around us have them too. The hope was to start on May 4th. They're not sure if they're going to be ready to do it by then, but that is the hope, is to start on May 4th. So, but there is going to be a training for volunteers on April 25th. They're looking for people who'd be willing to come down and help make the farmers market still go, given that we will obviously still be under social distancing at that point. I'm hearing various talk about social distancing going into 2021 or even 2022. It's, you know, we're not going back to the old days anytime soon. So. All right, well, thank you all again. And we'll say goodbye for now. The students are going to be coming back later and giving presentations on projects that they worked on. But next week is Earth Day week. Go participate in some of that. And thanks much to Leah and Beth. And I'll hang around to talk to Sydney for a few minutes afterwards.